Hi, friends. Welcome to the Mobile Bev Pros podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing mobile bar and event professionals with the information they need to succeed. I'm your host, business coach, and founder of the Mobile Bar Academy, Sarah Murphy. In each episode, the Mobile Bev Pros team will bring you industry experts, information, anecdotes, and opinions with the goal of assisting you in building a profitable, sustainable, and successful business that supports you in creating wealth. I'm excited to share with you today's episode, so let's get started. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about pricing. And shockingly, you reflected back to me the other day that in all 52 episodes of this podcast, we have never not once done an episode on pricing. And likely because I feel very passionately about this topic. And historically, I've tried not to be too dogmatic about things on the podcast. I'm generally very open-minded that there's lots of ways to look at all topics, but this one, like, I die on this hill. Today, we're going to talk about it. It's going to be spicy.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that you die on this hill because you get to see the back end, not only in your own mobile bar where you had experience with this, but you get to see the back end of so many people's pricing and how that directly correlates to their profitability and then eventually the sustainability of their business, right? So if you don't have solid pricing, you don't really have a business. And there are a lot of ways to skin this cat, but there's one that's most effective that leads to the most amount of profit. You want to tell us a little bit about the most common pricing structures that you see and what you love about those, what you hate about those?
Yeah, so I want to start with, traditionally, I've taught three that I have seen as the most popular, but Matt Maroon, who's an OG, he dropped in and answered a pricing question in the Facebook group not too long ago, and basically was like, ditch the math, it's value-based, like charge what you can charge. And so I'm going to start with that one because he's not wrong. And also, don't ditch the math. And the reason I say that is because if you were to ask people that are just getting started in this industry and potentially getting started in this industry from the place wherein they are either budget or mid-market buyers, when they price their services, they're going to look at it from the perspective of, can I afford this? Who can afford this? And that almost always leads to profit margins that are so low that people can't afford to stay in business. So when you're asking them to do value-based pricing, in most cases, those people cannot conceive of pricing themselves high enough to actually make a profit if you're to approach it from that perspective.
Yeah, we've talked about this loosely in a few other episodes. I call this shopping from your own wallet. And what I witnessed in retail and what we've seen here is that most people, when they're expected to look at things through the lens of value, they're looking at what they can afford. And the problem with that is that most mobile bar owners can't afford a mobile bar at all of their events. And so they're shopping from their own wallet and they're underselling themselves. And so until you've had the mindset of value readjusted and reflected back to you, that can be a really dangerous way to price your services.
Absolutely. This is exactly it. When we do the math with our clients, oftentimes they look at the pricing that gets spit out on the other end and they're like, holy moly, people will not pay that, which is not true. And we go through all of that at that point. But if we hadn't done the math and they hadn't seen the numbers, they would never have known that the value had to be at least that. And so if you're just saying price what people will pay or price what the value of what your service is, like, that is too nebulous for people to really wrap their minds around. And so while he's not wrong on that, and a matter of fact, that's kind of like a level 4. If you get to the place where you know what your math is, you know what you need to make, and that looks like $1,200 an event, and you have the opportunity to charge $2,400 for that same event, do it. Because it's not about the math, really. It's about what people will pay for things. And that's why Tiffany's has an $800 paperclip. You know what I mean? And so he's not wrong. Value-based pricing, it's where everyone wants to be. It's the sweet spot. It's where you get to play. That's luxury right there. And so, yes, value-based pricing, if you can get away with it, if you know how to do it and execute it and get paid for it, like chef's kiss, that's where everyone wants to be. Unfortunately, that's not where most people are. So value-based pricing, that's option number 1. Option number 2 that we see a lot is package pricing. Now, I'm going to just be completely upfront. I hate this one the most. I hate it the most. When I see package pricing, I want to shake something. And the reason I dislike package pricing is because the profit margin does not scale. And so I know why people do it. They do it for a number of reasons. They think it's easier to understand. They have services or components that they require in order to do business with them. And so they just throw it in the package and they're like, but it's included. You're not paying extra for it. It's part of the package. Even if you don't want to pay for it, that's just part of the package. It provides simplicity, and a confused mind won't buy. We know this. And so if you have a package bundling, then it's very easy to communicate. These are our three options, right? You can do this package or this package. And now it's easy for the client to understand what they're getting. It's easy for the business owner to make that offer, to make that sale, because it's all included and it's simple. Now, can we talk about all inclusive though for just a second? I actually, when I was reading the luxury strategy, this became crystal clear to me as to why this sometimes works and why this often doesn't. When you do all inclusive pricing, in order for it to work, it has to actually be all inclusive. Sandals Resorts is a great example of that. If you pay the Sandals Resorts fee, they have some add-ons and stuff, but you can have a luxury experience that is the standard for sandals without paying an extra dime. When we try and do that oftentimes in the mobile bar industry, where we're like, it's $1,500 up to 150 people for 4 hours. And then people are like, I'm a 5 hour event. So what does that do to the pricing? Or I actually have 155 people. What does that do to the pricing? Now we get into the nickel and diming space where it's like, oh, well, that's an additional $200 an hour. And that's an additional $6 per person or whatever. And so we're not really all inclusive, right? There's all these like little add-on fees or things, situations wherein you're paying more. Not less, mind you. If you have 125 people, you're not paying less. You're just paying more per person for that same experience, which well, I could get to that in a second. But in order for an all-inclusive package to feel good to a client, it has to actually be all-inclusive for the experience that they're offering for the entire. So if I'm 125 people, that works for me. But if I'm 155 people, that does not work for me any longer, right? And so it's not accomplishing what it's supposed to accomplish by being all inclusive, especially if there are add-ons for additional things, right? But anyways, package pricing, when you package something by guest count, so up to 150 people, and oftentimes what we see is up to 150 people with a set number of hours. Then if you're only 125 people, you're paying more per person for the same experience than you would if you had more guests. That oftentimes feels a little bit yucky. If I don't have as many hours, I don't need 4 hours, for example, I only need 3. Now I feel like I'm paying for something that I'm not actually getting. So that package has less value to me. Neither of these scenarios are ideal. The other reason it's not ideal is because you're not protecting your profit margins. So if you have a package that goes up to 150 people and potentially 4 hours, if there are only 100 people, you're making more profit. Yay. But if they have 150 people, now you're making less profit. Even though you're doing more work, you're using more of your mixers or whatever. There's more expenses on your part because the more hours and the more guests, the more expenses the mobile bar has. And so that's not ideal. We don't want to work harder and make less money profit margin wise. So packaging is lazy, in my opinion. When you have set packages, it's not doing anyone a service. It doesn't serve the clients because every event's probably got slightly different needs, slightly different guest counts, and it's not demonstrating value and it's not protecting profit margins. So package pricing, not a fan of. The third way that we see pricing is per person. So maybe it's $15 per guest, and this includes up to 4 hours. We have a very similar problem with this pricing model in that now we're looking at additional fees for additional time, additional per person pricing based on additional guest counts, depending on what the services are. It gets complicated, right? So it's $15 per person and it includes all of these things. But now there's rentals on top of that, or maybe you want an additional signature cocktail, and now that's an additional fee on top of that. And so it just gets a little bit complicated. And again, from a client's perspective, a confused mind won't buy. Also, anytime you're telling people that it's like a set price, $15 per person, and that includes a certain number of hours, there's a subset of people that are going to have to do mental gymnastics if their event is longer or shorter than what you've incorporated into the event. Now, sometimes we're using minimum of 4 hours and a minimum of 100 guests. And we're doing all of that because we're trying to achieve a certain revenue number to make it worth our time. And this I 100% understand. I call it the rolling out of bed number. I'm not going to go to an event unless I'm making at least this amount of money because I've got overhead I need to cover. And it won't be a profitable event for me unless I make that much money. There are better ways to achieve minimums than to say a minimum of 100 people. And that looks like a minimum spend requirement, which is totally fine. You can say, like, we have a minimum spend requirement of $1,200. And I don't care how you make that money up. It can be with anything. You want, extra sodas? I'll bring extra sodas. Like, extra bartenders or service, you want to add on some menus, like you name it. We can get creative as to how we meet that minimum spend, but I need to hit that in order for me to roll out of bed, in order to make the money that I need to make in order to keep this business running. So there are better ways to achieve the goal of a minimum spend than having a minimum number of hours or a minimum number of guests, because then you alienate people who have events that are shorter than what you are saying you need, or have events that are smaller but might be willing to pay more. And while I know that we're talking to the fringes here because people usually create their pricing based on averages, especially when you get started, you don't know what your averages are. And if you are looking at averages or setting averages, you're probably looking at everybody else that already has them, and you're thinking that they must have used or created those averages based on real information. And I can tell you, that's probably not the case. In many cases, people are just looking at other people and saying that must be what it is. And so we don't want to use data from other people's websites, first of all. And second of all, until you have been in business long enough to know what your averages are, it's probably best not to set minimums like that, especially when markets change enough that your very own business might have different averages based on what's going on in the economy and in the world around you. There really isn't a standard. Also, location matters a lot too, because in some areas of the world, 3-4 hours for a wedding is average. And in some areas of even our country, some areas like Wisconsin and up north, generally you see like a 5-6 hour minimum. And so you can't really look around and be like, oh, that's what I should include in my package. I feel like we need to keep those two things versatile. Pricing, in my opinion, and this is the fourth methodology, and this is what I teach, is that pricing should be based on how you pay for things. And so, for example, if you are paying your bartenders per bartender per hour, that's how you charge the client, per bartender per hour. If you are paying for your consumables, which is your cups, your napkins, those are the things that get thrown away and consumed. If you're paying for more of them based on how many guests there are and how much time they're drinking, then that's how the client pays for them, per person per hour. If you are paying for something per day, so for example, sometimes I'll see mobile bars being rented per hour. So they'll pay less. If it's a 2-hour event, they'll pay, let's say it's $250 an hour, and it's a 2-hour event. So they pay $500. But if it's a 3-hour event, they pay $750. Why? It's the same amount of work for you as the mobile bar owner to drive that thing there, to pick it up, to set it up, to break it down. But also you're losing out on revenue opportunity because you can't rent that twice in one day. And so I'm a big fan of daily rates and daily rentals for anything that is single use. So like you get the whole day. I can't rent it out again today anyways. And so there's a fee for this daily rental of this thing. I also think that fee should be high enough If it's just a rental and no additional services, it should be high enough that you're making more than you would if you were booking that event with ancillary services, because you don't have the opportunity to book that rig with ancillary services if it's just being rented out. So let's say you tack it on to a mobile bar package and you're charging $600 for it. Well, if it's just being rented as a piece of equipment to an event, it might look like $1,000 or $1,200 because you're missing out on the revenue that you would have gotten from those ancillary services if you were renting it along with bartenders and mixers and that sort of thing. So pricing per person per hour for things that are utilized per person per hour, pricing per day for things that are utilized, by the day, and pricing per bartender per hour for staffing, because that's how you pay them. If you pay your bartender shift pay, you can also mark that up and charge the client as well. But essentially, that means you're covering your costs, you're protecting your profit margins. And from there, once you have a good handle on the math of what your costs are, then you just price accordingly. I use a four-part pricing model. I teach that in the academy. It includes the costs plus the labor, which is like the biggest part that so many people forget. They forget that there's admin costs, that there's marketing costs, that there's time in sales processes. All of those things oftentimes just get written off as like, oh, I'm the owner and I'm doing it. Well, you're the owner and you should be paid. And if you ever have to hire someone to do that work, there's no money in the pricing set aside for that because you just did it for free. We have the cost of things. We add on the labor to execute those things. We add on the PETA tax, which I'm happy to go into more detail on. And then we add the profit margin. So the last thing that we do is actually tack on our profit. And by the time we're all said and done with that four-part pricing model, your pricing will look a whole lot different than it did.
Yeah. And for anybody who's listening, who's like, that sounds a lot more complex than all-inclusive packages. To your point, you teach this as the four-part pricing model. And when you get in and you break it down, it's actually really simple. We just saw Addison go through this in the accelerator. And in his weekly checkout, he was raving about how pivotal this has been for his business. Just this one process, just upgrading his prices, getting to know his costs and what he's paying for so that he can charge accurately. And though that process was daunting for him, he was feeling really lit up by the opportunities ahead. We've also seen so many people who have walked through this and they get that number on the other end and they're like, oh my gosh, who's going to pay me this? And then they come back into the accelerator and they're like, Sarah, I just booked 4 new events and they were all at these prices. Nobody even batted an eye. And that's where we want people to be. And so there are 2 options for people who want to learn to price appropriately and for profit. They can join the academy where everything is housed, or in our shop, they can purchase the Pricing Made Simple course where you teach just this if people have just this one pain point that they need solved, and they can really start profiting. Sarah, another question that we get a lot is, should my prices be on my site? Right? Because what you've just described here, it sounds like a more intensive quoting process. And so how could we ever even demonstrate, where our value starts and stops to clients who are just searching the webs for us when we won't really know what the cost of their event will be until we get their information?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The first thing that I want to point out is that my process, while I just spewed the 4 most common ways people price their mobile bar services and how there's only one real way, which was way number 4, there's a lot of math that goes into it. So if you do join the academy or you do buy it from the shop, yes, you're going to hear my lessons on both bundling versus packaging, but also the 4-part pricing model. There's also a worksheet that has a bunch of sample numbers in there so that you know what to put in there. And potentially you might not even need to change some of those numbers because things like cups are generally pretty standardized. And so we provide all the tools necessary to help people create their packaging and pricing with the understanding the spreadsheet is not meant for creating proposals for your clients. It's really meant to just experiment, get to know your costs, and recognize where your pricing needs to be. I had a question on the Q&A last week where she said, like, how do I put this pricing into my pricing? And I was like, you don't. I mean, I say at the very beginning of the lesson, like, whatever you've already accomplished in pricing your services is dead to you now. Like, you can pick that or this. You cannot make them combine. These are 4 very different pricing models. And the one that I teach does not work with the others. So there's a spreadsheet that helps break it down for you. And then one of the parts of that spreadsheet is what I call the base cost. And the base cost is also what I tell people is the roll out of bed fee. That means this is what we're rolling out of bed for. If it's not over this amount, then it's a no from us because it's not covering our base costs. And what's included in those base costs are overhead, travel, admin fees. And when I say overhead, oftentimes people forget to factor these in too. This is your insurance, this is your hosting for your website, this is potentially your membership to the academy, which I see as like a business related expense. Like you have professional fees to be in business, and that is included in there. Your telephone, your utilities, your car payment, if you've got it through your business, all of those things are overhead that you need in order to do business. And yet people are out here forgetting to include that in their pricing, but it's a cost of doing business. So if you're not paying for it with your pricing, how are you paying for it? Right. And that's why oftentimes people get to the end of the year and they're like, I made all of this money, but like I didn't take any of it home. Like none of it made it into my personal pocket. And that's because it goes to all of these somewhat hidden costs that are associated with running a business. And so that base cost can be the number that you stick on your website as being your minimum spend. If you're just a mobile bar tending service and you might have some satellite bars, but you don't have any huge overhead, like your rig with your commercial car insurance, storage fees for that rig, then that number usually looks to be about $800 before staffing. I know, sounds really crazy that like before you even add on staffing, you're starting with a base cost of $800, but that's generally what I see. The most simplistic businesses that I see that are running really lean, that number looks more about $400. But if you do have a rig and you do have commercial car insurance and those things, most of the time that number looks to be about $1,200. Now, when we do signature cocktail packages based on math, and the four-part pricing model, it usually looks to be about 50 cents per guest per hour, wherein we see a lot of people that have signature cocktail packages of like $6 a person for a 4-hour event. They're utilizing that cocktail markup to cover the expenses that are not cocktail related. And I don't like, fine. I don't care how you get your bottom dollar. They find success there because the end user or the guest, the people that are booking them, they don't really know what cocktails are supposed to cost or what they do cost or how that works. And so they're like, oh, $6 per person to have people drink for 4 hours. That seems like a great deal. It is, but only because it's more than just the cocktail costs that are going into that, right? They're also covering their overhead and they're covering their staffing. Like that stuff is going into that $6 a person. Cocktails are very inexpensive. It's lemon juice, lime juice, simple syrup, ice, cups, napkins. Like it's not an expensive offering, but our end users see a lot of value in it. So we do tend to have more flexibility on what we charge for signature cocktails. And so if you see people out there charging $6 a person for cocktail service, it's generally because that margin is covering some of the things they didn't factor elsewhere in their pricing. In our model, we keep the prices for services commensurate with the costs. And so while it looks like you're only charging $2 for 4 hours of drinking per person, yeah, but we're also like not rolling out of bed for less than $800 because that's the base cost of doing business. So there's a bit more transparency in our model in that what we charge for is based on what we are paying for those things. And because of that, and this is where I want to answer that other question that maybe you had, or maybe I just inferred around why people like Addison go through this program and now they have so much clarity and so much confidence in what their pricing is, because now they can see their pricing and their costs, and they know why they charge what they charge. Prior to coming through our program, so many people are just charging what they think they had to. That's what their competitors charged, and so that's what they're charging. But now they're having trouble booking at those rates, or people aren't paying them for those rates. And it's not the overall total, it's that they have no confidence in why they're charging what they're charging. They just know that someone else is charging that and getting that amount. And so when they come through this process, by the end of it, they're like, okay, now I know why I charged that for that at that rate. And now I know where I have margin so that I can play with offers or discounts or value adds because I have more recognition as to where the meat is on that bone, right? And so, for example, and this goes for almost across the board, if people are discounting their staffing, they don't have a good sense of where their expenses are, because for almost everybody, your staffing is going to be one of the highest costs that you have. If you're paying $25 a person and you're charging $50 a person, that's $25 margin. But then you also have your FICA, your employment taxes that go in there, right? And so your margins on staffing are very low. So if you're discounting staffing, there's not a whole lot of meat left to be discounting that. Now, if you're discounting the rate on your rig rental is essentially a sunk cost in almost all cases. You've already paid for it. And so while you do have to pay yourself back for it, there's also way more margin. And there is more margin because people see value in the rig. And so you can charge more for it. Typically, when we do math on these based on the cost of what someone pays for a rig, and then we average out about how many events they're going to use it for and for how many years and all that boring math stuff that the spreadsheet already does for them, they end up with a couple $100s per event is what they would need to charge. But you can charge way more than a couple $100s for those things. And so that's where a good portion of that profit margin can come from. So ultimately, it's important for us when we teach pricing that people know the math behind what we do so that they can make good managerial decisions going forward with their pricing, and they have confidence in why they're pricing things a certain way. And then also, when their costs go up, they have a better sense of how that's going to impact their pricing going forward. We recommend people take a look at their pricing at least every year during times of high economic flux and inflation every 6 months.
Yeah, so it sounds like you give people a stable foundation, which of course makes the house more secure, right? And so when people give you pushback about your prices, you're not insecure. And so you're not wavering. The house isn't made of sticks, and you can really stand on the value that you're providing. What are some of the common barriers you see? Because on the other hand, we have a lot of people who go through the pricing and packaging course or through the academy in that section, and they see that number and they go, "Oh no, I cannot do that." And then they don't, which of course, unfortunately, inevitably ends their business in a piecemeal sell on Facebook, right? And so, what are some of the barriers you see, mindset or otherwise, to people pricing even when they have that stable foundation staring them in the face?
The first thing that I'll say here is that you can charge anything for anything, and someone out there will buy it if they see value in it. And so, along with our process of saying, this is how you mathematically price your business so that you're making money. And I just had someone on Q&A today that was like, I did the calculator. I know about how many events I need to do in order to make the money that I want. Because we backward engineer. We're like, how much money do you want to make from this business? And what is your base cost on the average event? And then it spits out like, okay, you're going to have to do about this many events. We like to look at it from a number of different angles. And there are levers. And so if we get someone that comes through, and we've had this before, we had the ladies in North Carolina who came through and they were like, there's no way we can charge what you're telling us we need to charge. They had so much overhead. Like they had invested so much money into their business. And the answer from them was like, we can't do this. And when you say you can't, because there's no confidence coming from behind the pitch. And so if you don't have confidence that you can get that amount of money, the client isn't going to feel confident in giving you that amount of money. And so my response to them was, then don't charge this. Charge what you can feel confident charging, because then you're going to get that amount of money. But I make sure that they know that when you lower your rates in order to feel confident in your pricing, you're taking money from your own pocket to be there, because the only place that comes from is profit margin. So if you're charging less, that means that there's less profit, which means you get paid less. It just means that you're choosing to work for less. I'm not going to judge you for that. Like, I want you to feel good about your pricing and feel good about your business. And so I'm going to show you what you need to be charging in order to make a living at this. But if you choose to continue to do it, but making less money, there are other ways that you can do that. You can make less per event and do more events. So maybe that's what you want to sign up for: volume and quantity over the higher profit. I don't want to say quality, because you can still, a lot of people are undercharging for an amazing quality event. So like, it's not necessarily quality that they're sacrificing. They're just choosing that more quantity is what they want to provide, which is totally fine. That is absolutely an option. Some people want to hustle harder to make that additional profit margin. I'm not here to judge that. I'm just here to help show people the math. Oftentimes, when you spend a few years in this business, you know how much work is involved in it and how many expenses are involved in it, how hard it is, how grueling it can be sometimes, especially during the peak season. It's very easy for people to be like, I'm not getting paid enough for this. And that's the moment when they're like, I need to raise my prices. I need to do fewer events. Show me how to find the people that will pay for those events. And then we have a subset of those even in the accelerator right now, where they're burning down their budget business, basically, where they were charging much lower rates, and they're rebuilding their packages that have higher rates and more profit margins. And we're reimagining and pivoting the marketing, the messaging, and the positioning of their business towards a different market that's willing to pay a little bit more for the same service. So yeah, confidence is the linchpin in everything in life, but specifically in pricing your business.
And that's the value of the academy. So while you can purchase the Pricing Made Simple course from our shop, once you get that number back and you're like, oh, holy hell, nobody that I'm currently booking is going to pay me this price. That's where the academy has the advantage, because then you can just move on to the next section and start marketing your business to a more refined market. You can start really honing your tone, your messaging, really getting to know your ideal client, solidifying your archetype, and all that good stuff that help you secure those higher prices. And so while pricing might be a part of your problem, it's probably not the only problem that you're faced with, even if it feels like the most painful one you have right now.
One other thing that I want to mention here that I think is another important part of the conversation that I have on a regular basis around pricing is, okay, Sarah, I've gone through the spreadsheet, because the spreadsheet will actually spit out a pricing sheet for you. It'll say, these are the services that you said that you offer. This is what you should be charging for it based on how much money you said you wanted to make off of these things, the profit margin, the PITA tax, the whole 9 yards. This is your pricing now. And the next question that I get from people is, okay, well, how do I use this? Because it's not a package. There's no package here. And that's what people's brains are used to seeing, is packages, options on their website. And I'm so adamantly against packaging that that's, a question that people have. Like, thank you for this pricing sheet. How do I use it? Where do I put it? And they want to know, like, where my proposal? Can I put this information? No, don't. And this is one of the other hills that I've been recently dying on. If you've listened to the past podcasts, you've heard little bits and pieces of this. I'm not a believer that you should have a set Cheesecake Factory menu of options that you send someone that they have to then select from. Well, let's add this to the cart and this to the cart. And how many of these do I need? Because your client doesn't know what they need. They don't know how much of everything that they need. They don't know how to assemble the experience that they know that they want. That's your job. And so when you go through the pricing exercise and you have your pricing sheet, that is what you use to create customized proposals when people drop into your inbox. And you can do that in Honeybook. You can do it in Dubsado. You can use eCinch for that. Although, again, I don't recommend using eCinch so that your client can play with it, because your client doesn't know what they need and they're only overwhelmed. And at that point, you've lost them. So I use it on the back end because I think it's the easiest and the best way as a mobile bar owner to go through and quickly create a proposal that scales. That's the beautiful thing about eCinch, is that it will adjust your pricing automatically based on guest count, duration, any location even. It adds like travel fees and stuff once you set it up. So it makes that whole process really painless and very easy. But your pricing that comes out at the other end of this pricing exercise is for you to know. It's invisible to the client. And you then create customized proposals for your client based on their needs. And so the question I got today earlier was like, okay, great, I've got this pricing, but how do I use this in a wedding versus a corporate? Well, it's the same. You don't need different pricing for weddings and corporate. You don't need different pricing for baby showers, because you're not packaging based on hours. You're not packaging based on guest count. Like, you could have a mimosa bundle. Again, I teach bundling versus packaging. You could have a mimosa bundle that has the juices that you include in that and like special garnishes. And like, you could tack that on to a baby shower as an add-on, but you don't need different packages. You have one set pricing list and you get to alter the way it's utilized based on the needs of the customer. What is the experience they're trying to have? add the necessary components to create that experience, and send that proposal. There is no packaging. You don't need special packages for special situations. So on your website, when you're trying to demonstrate what you offer, you can inspire them utilizing images. Or I was working with one of our accelerators the other day on her website, and she had her packages, and I said, well, why don't we just call out options for experiences? So like, here's a garden party, here's a corporate happy hour, here's a full service wedding. You don't have to give pricing to inspire people as to how they can use you, but we do want to inspire people as to how they can use you, especially if you're trying to like rank for SEO. People might be looking for a garden party bartender. We can do that through calling out or labeling, bundling experiences on the website without including bullet points of everything that's included there. Tell the story.
Well, this has been fabulous. Again, super valuable. Sarah, did you have any last and final words, any big takeaways for people from this episode?
I live here. I've spent years analyzing people's pricing, doing math on pricing, thinking about pricing strategically so that I can teach how to do it in a way that protects profit margins, scales with the size of events and the variables of events. There are three main variables of events, right? So there's guest count, there's duration, and there's services rendered. There's also location, right? There's a travel fee, but that could be considered services rendered. And so I'm so deep into this that I recognize that when I geek out on pricing, I almost probably push people into packaging because they're like, I'd rather it just be easy, even if I'm losing a little bit of money on the hind end. I'll just make that up by charging a little bit extra and we'll call it a day. But I promise you that if you price using the 4-part pricing model, which I have simplified as much as I possibly can so that people do not necessarily have to understand all of the idiosyncrasies behind, that your business will be way more scalable. You'll have way more understanding and comfortability with your pricing. It'll be more flexible so that it's not all that challenging when people come to you with new requests for events that you might never have done, because you know that you need to charge at least this if you're going to offer this service, or if you're going to provide this much staff, or if you're going to do these things. So you're not stuck in your own packages. You don't have to do mental gymnastics every time someone shows up and has a request that's slightly outside the 3 current packages that you offer. So it's worth it. And I know that it's a lot, and I know that I probably threw a lot. I don't think I probably simplified this topic for anyone who's listening, other than to say, I promise you I've thought more about this than the average human. And I have taught it to over 1,000 mobile bars. And some of my most successful clients are using this methodology with ease. And that's the other thing. Once you do the work of setting up your pricing, it's so, so, so easy to use. Hopefully, there's at least a few listeners that gained a little bit of clarity from the information shared today.
For sure. And that's how you get paid and make a profit. Thanks so much, Sarah. And we will talk to you guys on the next one.
And that wraps up today's episode. I hope it was valuable. I would love to hear from you what you thought. You can drop me a line at hello@mobilebevpros.com or find me on Instagram at mobilebevpros. If you're looking for more valuable mobile bar related content, we have a website full of it. You can find us at www.mobilebevpros.com. And I'd love to see you in our Facebook community, also by the name of, you guessed it, Mobile Bev Pros. Thank you for joining me today, and until next time, cheers.